Our guest today is Anthony Peake. Anthony Peake is a writer who deals with borderline areas of human consciousness. Anthony has written many books, and these include The Out-of-Body Experience, The History and Science of Astral Travel, Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When We Die, The Daemon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, The Labyrinth of Time, The Illusion of Past, Present and Future, and Time and the Rose Garden, Encountering in the Life and Works of J.B. Priestley. You're not planning to went down to Crawley in West Sussex to talk to Anthony Peake about near-death experiences, your daemon, and cheating the Ferryman Hypothesis, and is life an illusion? Well, is it? So let's find out, shall we? Enjoy the program. Thank you for watching.
Welcome to Nine Planet, where we have today our special guest, Anthony Peake. Sorry, I nearly said peace. Anthony Peake, always. Here we are in his lovely home in Crawley. Took us a while to get here, thanks to the M25, but we're here. And over to you, if you'd like to tell us
basically a little bit about background of myself. I'm a writer, been writing now for around about, 15, 16 years. I've written 10 books, now working on my 11th at the moment. Books seem to have sold quite well and seem to be proving quite popular in the sense that my books are now in every major European language. And also in quite a few minor languages, such as Croatian. In fact, a few years ago, I was all over Croatian television for a few days. I was on every single major TV program in Croatia, which is really quite
What
cool.
was that? Why?
Two of my books, by different publishers, had been bought by two different Croatian publishers. So they invited me over to Zagreb. And I guess because you don't get that many people going over to Zagreb, they got me on every single major TV programme, including even breakfast television and everything else as well. So it was really good, and they filmed me in Zagreb itself. They did some quite good stuff actually, because they were interested in my take on near-death experiences. So we did a mock-up in the old town, which was really good, where they actually had somebody pretend they'd been killed, and then they rise up above their body and everything else as well. You know, they did these kind of clever effects and everything else as well, which was really good. And they made me very, very welcome.
Did you find different nations and cultures respond to your work more than, say, others?
Yeah, it tends to be the case that, I'm very popular in America for obvious reasons. But I find sometimes that breaking through into the UK is a good deal harder than going abroad. I mean, for instance, I was on national television in France and Germany 3 years ago on my book on Philip K. Dick. And I went over to Paris and they filmed me in Paris and everything else as well. And it was on RTE TV. And that proved again extremely popular. But in the UK, I mean, the only thing I've really done of any real acclaim was I was on Radio 5 Live around about 1 o'clock in the morning, around about 7 or 8 years ago.
Why do you think it is? Do you think we're overcritical, or do you think we're closed-minded?
No, I think...
Or is it the media?
I think it's purely and simply the media. I mean, you can't... It's very difficult to get the media interested. It drives me crazy because my work is very extensive and I cover so many different subject areas. And I genuinely believe I'm the only writer that's dealing with so many different topics. You know, and weaving into those topics, you know, things about movies, about music. Yeah. And I'd always thought that the mass media would be really interested in what I do, but they don't. They don't seem to be, which is rather frustrating.
You think that's part to do with the whole idea of keeping the whole esoteric or the hidden knowledge pushed down?
No, I think the issue is they are more than happy to cover people who write about esoteric subjects. And I think they like doing that because they can actually put them down. I think they can be in a
So you can
position
put them up to
whereby
ridicule.
they'll put them up to ridicule them.
Yeah.
But I'm somebody that can't be ridiculed. I know that sounds vain and it sounds crazy, but I really do know my stuff. So people want to talk about Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. I'll talk about it. People want to talk about the Cowley exclusion principle. I can talk about it because I know about it. I make it my effort to extraordinary
What was that
claims.
you said? What was it? The Heisenberg? What?
Because extraordinary claims need extraordinary proofs. A guy called Marcello Trui many, many years ago made that statement. People can say it's Carl Sagan, but it wasn't exactly a guy called Marcello Trui. And the idea is that if you make extraordinary claims, literally your proofs have to be greater.
Yeah.
And it's what I do. But if you're going to put somebody on a TV program where you're going to set them to fail, you don't want somebody who's going to do that. You don't want somebody who's going to be able to come straight back at the critics and say, actually you're wrong. Do you realise, for instance, that DMT has been found in the brain of live rats worked on by Jimo Borgigian at the University of Michigan? They don't want to hear that. They want to hear, well, is it not right? Whereas I see on television an awful lot people getting crucified by the critics, and they set themselves up for it.
You're able to stand strong against that.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
As I was saying earlier, I'm an aggressive little Scouser by background, and I absolutely love. If somebody wants to have a go at me, it's brilliant.
Yeah.
It's what I love. Working class Scouts people, we like that. So bring it on. So I'm in a position where I can do that, and I can talk the talk and walk the walk. And because I've got a really weird mind, my mind, I don't forget facts, and sometimes I find it quite strange that I can recall information and I'll know it's right, and afterwards I'll look it up and it'll be right.
Yeah, I've noticed that when I've watched somebody talk, you're very good at referencing the author, the date.
Yeah. Well, it's profoundly important, and I think there's a reason for this again, and I think it's backed up by my writings, my own research, because when I don't know if you know. When the baby's in the womb, the gestation period, there is a massive die-off of cells, neuronal cells in the brain, of the embryo around the last 4 or 5 weeks of gestation before the baby's born. And they're completely replaced, they just die off. Okay. Now, I was weird in the sense that my mother was seriously ill with toxemia, blood poisoning. We were poisoning each other. And there was the circumstances where my mother was told that you can either have, you unofficially cannot have an abortion because abortions are legal, but we can do something with the child because you're going to kill each other. And my father said, no, we can't do that, we'll go through with it. But they then had to do emergency caesarean section on my mother, and 5 weeks before I was born. So they had to get me out quickly, and they dragged me out, they broke my arm. They actually pulled me out, and they pulled me out with such a fire, they broke my arm, okay? Which meant that 5 weeks before, I didn't get the die-off. Okay. Now, on top of that, what also I didn't get was the impact of chemicals and everything else when the baby's in the birth canal. So I didn't get that either.
What, the flooding of the adrenaline?
Yeah, and everything else when the child is coming through. So I missed that. Now, on top of that, I was peculiar in the sense that I was in an incubator for around about, I think it was up to 2 months. So I had no human contact, because in those days, incubators, you were just inside this glass shell.
Yeah.
So for the first 2 months of my life, I had no human contact. I didn't have the cell die-off and the other bits and pieces, because there's an argument to say that when the baby's in the birth canal, for instance, they get an impact of DMT within the birth canal. Okay. So I missed all that. And I think this is why my brain is strange, because I also believe that I suspect I'm possibly autistic, or with something similar like that, but because I'm also very good with people, I have the advantage of all the advantages of having an autistic mind where I can remember things, but the advantage of the fact that I seem to be fairly personable and I seem to be fairly popular and liked by people. So, and I earn my...
All the symptoms of a psychopath.
All the symptoms, exactly. No, very true. And
I picked that up in the last 20 minutes.
Yeah, well, fully enough.
Very intense.
Fully enough, I was doing a talk. I was doing an interview for an American company during this week, and we were discussing setting up a cult. And I said, you'd be ideal for a cult.
Yeah, how did I pick that up?
Stand up there.
I see you in the costume and everything.
Oh well, I am doing an event near you in
Yeah, we spoke
It's
about
in
that
there,
before, didn't we? Yeah.
Drakelow Caves.
I clicked on it, but I couldn't find a price for it.
You need to email directly,
email direct.
Matt, and he'll get back to you.
Yeah.
But I'll be wearing a cowl then, and I'll
Oh,
be actually
really?
coming in as the Hades, the god of the
I
underworld.
could see you doing that. That was yeah.
I remember, again, a few years ago, 10, 11 years ago, I spoke in New York at a big event at the Roosevelt Hotel in New York. A friend of mine, Susan Marie Kovalinsky, put up all the money for it. She put up for my flight, she booked the hotel. She actually booked in the Roosevelt Hotel, there's this huge ballroom. And if anybody knows the movie Wall Street, it was the Greed is Good speech.
Yeah.
Okay, that's where that was filmed. And I was standing on that stage. Okay, and there were about 350 people there. And it was amazing because I actually felt at one stage, that said to them, stand up, sit down, pause in the middle, they'd have done so.
It was in the palm of your hand.
It was really enthralling. But what was fascinating was that halfway through it, this guy stood up in the audience and he said, I think you're a bullshitter. I don't think you're what you're claiming to be. And he turned around to me and said, I put you on a challenge now, and this is why I mentioned this. He turned around and he said, explain to me Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, because I'm a physicist from Princeton down the road. So I did explain Heisenberg's uncertainty principle to him. And I said, did I get that wrong then? And he said, no. And I said, right, can I talk to you afterwards about this? Disappeared. Gone. Because they don't like it. They like the idea of, we know better than you do.
Yeah.
But the issue is they are silo thinkers. They think, I'm a physicist, I'm a quantum physicist, I'm a cosmologist, I'm a neurologist, I'm a neurochemist. And they as they do their PhDs, they get smaller and smaller areas.
Compartmentalised, don't they?
No, whereas what I do is I broaden it out as far as I possibly can and go as deep as I possibly can, because I just want to know.
And then quite a lot of the times it all connects together anyway, doesn't it? Yeah.
Well, that's the amazing thing. I mean, the amount of times that I've had the Eureka moment where, I've got all the information, I'm going, it's like having a jigsaw puzzle, all the bits are there, and then suddenly they all fall into place. Like my first book, Is There Life After Death? I didn't have a clue where I was going to go with that. Yeah. Not at all. I just followed my daemon. I followed my muse. I followed ideas. And they just went in one direction and another direction. I was going, what is going on here? And then suddenly it all came together, and the cheating the Ferryman hypothesis came out of that, which we might talk about later. But to me, this is the whole creative process. At the moment, I'm halfway through my next book. And only 2 weeks ago, I was thinking, where the hell is this? How am I going to pull this all together? I've got so much information. 70,000 words I'm supposed to write. I've got 140,000 words written. How am I going to reduce this down? And I was just lying in bed, and suddenly this idea came. Don't do it the way you're doing it. I was doing it with themes. And I thought, something I had just said, do it historically.
So when you say
So
something...
the answer's just the answer's just...
So you accept that?
Well, my hypothesis I put forward, and I do find that I've got evidence of this in my life, and evidence of lots of people who've written to me from around the world in terms of this. In a nutshell, what I suggest is, and what my books say, and have been saying consistently, is that this is a simulation. We exist in some form of simulation. You are existing in a simulation of your own life. The simulation of your own life is like a third-person computer game. Okay. Imagine the scenario: you're playing a computer game. You switch on the computer for the first time. The on-screen sprite is there. Say it's Lara Croft in Tomb Raider. Lara Croft runs down the corridor. You're the game player. She runs down the corridor, goes into the room, gets killed. Lara's dead. Bang. She's gone. She's forgotten. She's dead. You're not. So you come back and you generate another Lara Croft in the next game. This Lara Croft is reborn again with no memories of the fact that there was a previous Lara Croft. She goes down the corridor and suddenly something tells her, don't go into that room. She doesn't know what it is. And it's the game player, and the game player says, don't go in there, it was dangerous, go down that corridor. She goes down that corridor, she gets killed again. Now imagine a scenario that your life is like that. That within the greater universe of the simulation, and again, I go into detail of the science of why we believe this could be a simulation. This is not an idea at the top of my head and I'm thinking, it just makes sense. We know from the work with people like Juan Maldacana, people like Jacob Bekenstein, an Israeli scientist, Craig Hogan at the Perimeter Institute in America. These guys have been looking at the pixelation of space.
Yeah.
You know, we know that it's pixelated.
Pixelated.
We also know that it's something to do with holograms. We know it works holographically, and we know it works digitally. So imagine a scenario that within the 0 point field, the Akashic record, the Akashic field, whatever you like, programmed in there is every outcome of every decision you can make in your life. Like a computer simulation game, you know, whereby whenever you do the change, when Lara Croft goes down another corridor, of course a new reality is rendered by the computer program to accommodate the fact of the decision you've just made, or the decision the game.
Is that because they've already been played and you're just tapping into them, or they're waiting to be played?
They're probably waiting to be played, and you're the observer.
Yeah.
But effectively as well here, you get some kind of interesting points here, because, for instance, Stephen Hawking, before he died, he was involved working with a guy called Frank Hartle, who's a CERN physicist.
Yeah.
And they came up with something they call the top-down hypothesis of quantum physics. And the top-down hypothesis is effectively that you probably know that in quantum physics, the act of observation, or the act of measurement, collapses a potential statistical wave function into a point particle. So effectively, before any subatomic particle is actually measured, it only exists in potentiality. Not only does it only exist in potentiality, but it could be anywhere. And it's only by the act of observation. Or the act of measurement that it shrinks to a point particle in a particular position.
And is our expectation that sort of determines the outcome? Or?
Well, this is the interesting thing, because I've been arguing now, and I've been building up a case for this, that I think that when quantum physicists are actually measuring subatomic particles, and when they hypothesize about particular subatomic particles, they effectively bring them into existence. Because there's case after case in particle physics where people have postulated a particle, like the muon, and suddenly it happens, suddenly it's there. I mean, E. Rabi, who was a famous American quantum physicist, they were working on trying to find the muons, and they found them, or they found one. And they found another subatomic particle, and he turned around to the people around him and he said, "Who ordered that?" And he was being semi-facetious. But you find, for instance, in quantum physics, Max Planck, in 1900, was trying to discover the issues with something called the ultraviolet catastrophe. I won't go into details about it, but it was a real problem that science had at that time. Yeah. They couldn't explain certain things to do with black body radiation. Max Planck tried and tried and tried and couldn't come up to a conclusion, until in the end, in a moment of absolute desperation, he plugged in a particular set of numbers that he just made up at the top of his head. And he then thought that energy comes in quanta, it comes in little packets. And once he'd done that, the maths then worked, and this catastrophe that they thought was going to happen didn't happen. But that was the quantum revolution. Suddenly the world had changed. But it's this Planck constant I'm fascinated by. It was an act of desperation. Yet they find this everywhere now. This number occurs everywhere within the way our understanding of the universe. So could it be that what is happening is consciousness is the baseline of everything, and everything within the external world is in some way being collapsed by the act of observation? Now the point you're saying here is an interesting one. Does this mean we can anticipate in some way and change our own futures? Now if we're in a simulation, now going back to the simulation argument, the Lara Croft analogy, imagine that you could create a simulation of your own life with all the outcomes all out there. You live your life. Now imagine, for instance, in one of my books I suggested, imagine you had a VR headset, virtual reality headset, with feedback to your ears for stereo sound, and you had a body suit that you were in that had tactile feedback, which meant that when you move in this reality, in the simulated reality you're in, your movements are a one-to-one relationship between what's in the simulation and where you really are. And then your memories of who you really are wiped clean. So you don't know who you are. Then you're born in this simulation, and every movement you make, even though you are somewhere else, you're in this virtual reality.
It wouldn't be long before you'd forget.
Totally. You never even knew.
Forgot,
You never even knew. Now, in Platonic thought, in ancient Greek thought, they even have a term for this. They called it amnesis. And when you remember the fact that you've forgotten, it's called anamnesis. Philip K. Dick wrote about this. Now, one of the things I'll be doing in this Dracula Caves thing is reproducing Plato's Cave, reproducing the idea of reality reality is something that we believe. I don't know if you know the Plato's Cave myth.
With the shadows.
The shadows.
Yeah.
Just to explain, imagine a scenario that there are a group of people who for all their lives have been chained in a cave, looking at a back wall of the cave. Behind them is a fire. And between the fire and them is a little bridge. And walking over the bridge, people walk over the bridge with cardboard cutouts of animals' heads and everything else, and they walk across. Meanwhile, the people in the cave are tied together, staring at the cave. They've never known anything else. They believe the reality, and everything is reality, are the shadows on the wall of the cave.
Yeah.
Now imagine a scenario that one of the group breaks his shackles, turns round and realises it's not what it seems. And he goes past the fire and he goes through the cave entrance and sees the reality as it really is. He then goes, wow, this is incredible. He goes back and tells his friends and says, this is not the reality. It's much bigger, it's much greater, it's much wider. And it's what his friends say, you're a nutter. Your brain's gone. And this is what I'm going to be doing in the caves, because we're going to take some of the people, we're going to place them deep in these caves, in these tunnels, and reproduce this effect. To say, now look, what is real, what isn't real. Now, if you were then in that simulation case, how could you tell that it wasn't a simulation? You would have no way of knowing. Because we never ever interface with anything out there. I argue this with people. People turn around and say, of course it's real, look. That's real. No, it's not. You're never touching that. It's the electrostatic repulsion is what you're feeling.
It's all about perspective, isn't it?
Yeah, it reminds me of that. I can't remember her name. A lady had a near-death experience. I think she had cancer. And I was telling you about it, where she says the only way to explain it is like, imagine you've got a flashlight and you're in a big warehouse. I can't remember her name.
Yeah.
But I love that. And she says, like, obviously she'd seen that all these possibilities. And then coming back into this light, it's like, the flashlight, all of a sudden the lights are turned on and you can see everything that's raised, but then you're back to your flashlight.
Through a keyhole, isn't it?
Yeah, because all you ever do, the flashlight, it's the idea, isn't it? You only ever see what the flashlight shows you.
It's as if our body
tiny narrow band, isn't it?
But
that flashlight.
But the thing is, even our understanding of the universe, if you talk to cosmologists, there's something called the light cone. And there's things within the universe itself that we can never know, because these things are already further away than the speed of light can bring things in. And there's a cone of what we can know and what we can't possibly know. And this is the same with perception. Perception, for instance, vision. What is happening? You're looking at me now, I'm talking, but what is actually happening is photons of light, tiny particles, and then you get photons, you start thinking about photons of light, photons of electromagnetic energy. What the hell are they? They travel only at the speed of light. They can never be any slower than the speed of light, which means from their point of view, time does not exist. And on top of that, they have they're point particles. They have no extension in space. So they travel at the speed of light, there's no time for them, and there's no space for them. So space and time don't exist for photons. And yet this is what makes us see. Magically. So photons hit me, they bounce off my body, or ones that are not absorbed, they enter your eyes. They bounce across in a wave or a particle, because we don't know whether photons are waves or particles, and we don't know any subatomic particles, they're waves, they're particles, depends on how they're looked at. So the photon hits your eye, goes through your pupil, goes through your aqueous humour, and by the way, the photon is not the same photon. Photons hit each other, and all they're doing is they're transferring energy. They're carriers, they're bosons, they're carriers of energy. They're not actually anything other than carriers of energy, electromagnetic energy. They go through your aqueous humour, and they hit at the back of your eye, they hit your retina. Your retina is postage stamp sized, bent and inverted. At the point of the retina, the light hitting it, or the photons hitting it, are converted into an electric signal. The electric signal is then sent via your optic nerve to the deepest, darkest part of your brain back here. And there, this signal is magically created from a postage stamp inverted image to this. This three-dimensional surrounding you reality. Now on top of that, there are mysteries about this. There's a guy called Richard L. Gregory, one of the world's leading experts on vision systems. He died a couple of years ago. He was a professor at University of Bristol. Gregory wrote a book called Eye and Mind, And he discusses in great detail how mysterious sight is. Because, for instance, at the back of each of your eyes, there is a little blind spot where your optic nerve leaves the back of your eye. You are blind there. You have a blind spot in your visual field. In both your visual fields, there's a blind spot. Your brain fills in the details from the information around it.
We'll talk about this, won't we?
Yeah, because I was going to say, what's your sort of view on beliefs and how powerful because if our brain is filling in this information and it's filling it in from our belief or what it believes should be there, because I'm quite a thing of how our beliefs are very powerful.
Beliefs are, for instance, if you get the opportunity, if you have not seen this, I strongly advise you do it. And if you haven't seen it, I won't go any further on this, but I'll just suggest you do it. If you go onto YouTube and Google something called Gorillas in Our Midst, okay? It's a pun on gorillas in the midst, okay? Just Google it and follow the instructions of what you're supposed to do. I will guarantee you will be stunned, because this proves beyond any shadow of a doubt that what is out there and what we see are completely different.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla?
Our visual systems and our brains work on what we are anticipating to see, rather than what is actually out there. And of course, light, colour, everything is black out there. There is no colour, there is no red, red is nowhere. You know, and on top of that, not only that, but the physical reality we think is physically real is 99.99999999999 empty space. And what is physically real there are quarks. And quarks themselves are just actually stimulations in a field. So where does suddenly all this reality that everybody is telling us is so real go? It disappears.
So this simulation was created by somebody. Who? Is it just a future us?
It's probably a future us. There was a paper written about 1999. And in the paper, and I always forget the guy's name actually, which is really frustrating. I used to remember it, but I'm getting older now, so my record's not as good as it was. It'll come to me in a second. But in the paper, oh no, it'll come to me. Anyway, he was a mathematician, I think, at Cambridge. And his logic is quite powerful. Have you heard of Moore's law?
No.
Okay. Moore's law, Moore was one of the original founders of Intel. In the 1960s, he said that our ability on processor and processor speeds and what we can do on printed circuit boards will probably double every 2 or 3 years. Moore's law is proven to be quite correct, and it does work out that way, which means that over time we have got more and more processing power. The only thing we're limited by is miniaturization and nanotechnology. But as many as we're just limited by the amount of printed circuit boards we can get on. But we could come up with a new form of computing, like quantum computing, for instance, that means that there's much more power available. Now, what would you do? Future civilizations. Well, we like making simulations. We're doing it now with virtual reality and everything else as well. It is highly likely that sometime in the future somebody will say, do you know what we need to do? An ancestor sim. We need to create a simulation with ancestors. And we can download all the information about people's lives, and then we'll populate the ancestor sim and see what happens. And That's what they believe is taking place. Our own future people have created this simulation. And again, this is what Elon Musk was saying when he, a couple of years ago, made this famous statement about living in a simulation. It is so powerful in terms of the argument that we are in a simulation. Now they've managed to simulate a very small part of the universe already. All we're restricted to is the data.
Yeah.
Now, if that's the case, would they bother to create the simulations? Well, highly likely, because this is what human beings do. So could it be that you are a simulation created by your descendants, that you're existing? Now the interesting thing and the difficult problem here was it's something called a substrate problem. If you're a simulation, now, so think about it, say I was able to scan your brain in its totality down to the quark level and scan it, digitize it and upload that information into a computer and then kill you. Is that copy of everything down to the nanotechnology level you? Will that be conscious and aware, and will it be you? Now the substrate problem is we don't think so. And we don't think so because there's that magical something called consciousness. Now I've argued in a previous book and I've said, where does consciousness come from? David Chalmers, an Australian philosopher in the late 1990s at a conference in Arizona, actually posited this and said the hard problem of science is how inanimate matter in the brain creates consciousness. Because all that your brain is chemicals reacting in electric fields. That's all that's happening in there. There is nothing else. And the qualitative difference between me with my hopes, my dreams, my fears, and bits of electricity flicking around my brain, they're totally different things. Consciousness doesn't have extension in space.
Well, we relate to ourselves here, don't we, in our brain, don't we?
Yeah, and the only way you do that is because our eyes can sense things.
Yeah.
If your eyes were on your knee, you'd see the worldview from your knee.
Yeah.
We feel that we are encased in here. But it is more and more evident that in fact consciousness is a field that we are tuned into.
It's outside that we tune into.
It's
We are
exactly
the tuner, aren't we?
Yeah, we are.
yeah, we are the radio tuner picking up the signal.